JD Vance pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner, a modest spot in the heart of Springfield, Ohio. The kind of place that had been around for decades, its neon sign flickering slightly in the evening air. The scent of grilled burgers and fresh coffee slipped through the crack of the door every time someone stepped inside. He had heard about the place from a local earlier that day, someone who swore by their homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. After a long day of meetings, handshakes, and policy discussions, all JD wanted was a quiet meal before the long drive back. As he stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled. The diner was small but welcoming, at least that's how it felt. At first, regulars occupied their usual booths, and a wall of faded Polaroids by the register showcased decades of customers and staff. The air was thick with the scent of bacon grease and fresh coffee, the low hum of conversation filling the space. JD caught the eye of the hostess behind the counter. She was mid-smile until she recognized him. It was quick, barely a second, but he noticed it. A hesitation, the kind that flickered across someone's face when they weren't sure what to do. Her lips pressed together in a thin line. He glanced around. A few customers had turned their heads in his direction. One man, halfway through his burger, leaned in and whispered something to the person across from him. A woman in a flannel shirt set down her coffee cup a little too hard, eyes narrowing slightly before she looked away. JD wasn't naive. He'd been in enough rooms to sense when he wasn't entirely welcome. But in a diner? Here? The hostess hesitated before stepping forward, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Good evening," she said, her voice careful. "Dining in or takeout?" JD let out a small, tired chuckle. "Dining in, if that's all right." Another pause. Too long for a simple question. She glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at him. "I just need to check something real quick." "One moment." She disappeared through the swinging door, leaving JD standing there. A few more heads turned his way. A man at the counter shifted in his seat. Someone muttered under their breath. Something wasn't right. From behind the kitchen doors, muffled voices rose and fell, too low to make out. JD exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He wasn't going to assume anything. Maybe it was a policy. Maybe they were short-staffed. Then the hostess returned. This time, she didn't look uncertain. She looked decided. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice firmer now. "We can't serve you tonight." But the way she said it, the way the whole room seemed to tighten around her words, made it clear. This wasn't about business. This was personal. For a moment, JD Vance said nothing. The words just hung there between them, thick and heavy, the kind that didn't need an explanation. The diner had gone quiet. Not silent, but quiet enough. The sizzle of the grill still crackled in the back. A fork scraped against a plate somewhere, but the usual hum of conversation had dulled. People were watching, waiting. JD studied the hostess's face. She wasn't hostile, just firm, like she'd made up her mind, or maybe someone else had made it up for her. His eyes flicked past her to the kitchen window. A pair of cooks stood just beyond the counter, half hidden behind a heat lamp stacked with plates. Their expressions unreadable. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, did I do something wrong?" The hostess didn't fidget this time. "It's just, we'd rather not serve you tonight. No policy. No, we're closing soon." Just that. JD let his hands settle on his hips, exhaling through his nose. He'd been in his fair share of uncomfortable situations, from political debates to interviews designed to trip him up. But there was something different about being turned away from a simple roadside diner. A cough broke the moment. JD turned slightly, catching the gaze of an older man sitting near the counter. The guy looked like he'd been coming here for years. His blue work jacket frayed at the cuffs, his hands weathered from a lifetime of labor. He shook his head, more to himself than anyone else, before stabbing at the last of his eggs. A few booths over, a woman shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable. Across from her, a younger man, probably in his 30s, leaned back with his arms crossed like he was enjoying the show. JD took it all in, The eyes that looked away the second they met his, the ones that lingered too long, the ones that held something sharper, something closer to satisfaction. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had options. He could walk out, shake his head, let it go. He could demand an explanation, call them out, ask if they had any idea how this would look in the morning news cycle, and for a moment he considered it. But then, he could have challenged them outright. He could have forced them to say it again, to make them realize they were refusing service to a sitting U.S. senator. But he did none of those things. "All right," JD said, nodding slowly. His voice was even measured. "Can I speak with the manager?" That caught a few people off guard. The hostess hesitated again, glancing toward the kitchen as if seeking silent permission. At the counter, the older man muttered something under his breath. Someone near the window let out a short, disbelieving laugh, like they couldn't believe he was actually going through with this. JD just waited. The hostess disappeared through a different door this time. The diner settled into a tense quiet. A sip of coffee, a plate sliding across the counter, the rhythmic scrape of a fork against ceramic. Then the door swung open. A man in his early 50s stepped out, broad-shouldered, thick arms crossed over a grease-stained apron. His name tag read, Don didn't ask JD what he wanted. He just looked him over once and said, "I hear you got a question." But the way he said it wasn't welcoming. It wasn't even polite. It was a challenge. JD met Don's stare, steady, unreadable. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to throw his weight around, but he also wasn't about to walk out without understanding why. "Yeah," JD said. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don exhaled sharply through his nose, like he'd been expecting the question but wasn't in the mood to answer. He wiped his hands on his apron, glancing at the handful of customers still watching. Some pretended not to listen. Others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. "Look," Don said, shifting his weight. "This ain't personal." JD raised an eyebrow. "Seems pretty personal." Don's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck, then finally sighed. "People around here got their opinions about you, about the things you stand for," he said. "I got a business to run and I don't want trouble." JD nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "And me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" Don didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the counter, where the old man in the work jacket had gone back to his eggs, chewing a little slower, now. A few booths away, the younger guy still had his arms crossed, watching like this was the best entertainment he'd had all week. JD had seen this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough to know this wasn't just about a single decision. This was about something bigger, and everyone in that room knew it. This wasn't just about one decision. It was about what it meant, how it would look, how people would react. It was about the ripple effect, the pressure from all sides, the silent expectations that could push a person into choices they weren't sure about. JD glanced back at Don. "Be honest with me," he said. "Do you agree with this? Or is this just about keeping the peace?" Don hesitated. His fingers curled slightly against his apron. And for the first time, JD saw something that almost looked like discomfort. Like maybe Don wasn't as sure about this as he wanted to seem. But before the man could answer, a sharp laugh cut through the room. "Oh, come on," the younger guy in the booth scoffed, shaking his head. "This ain't that deep. You're just not welcome here. Simple as that." JD turned toward him, studying him for a moment. The guy looked like someone who enjoyed a fight, someone who had been waiting for an excuse to say something. JD didn't bite. He just looked back at Don. "I've got no problem leaving," he said, evenly. "If that's really what you want." The words hung in the air, giving Don a chance to take a breath, to reconsider, to push back against whatever pressure had led to this moment. Don's gaze flicked toward the kitchen, then back to JD. "I just don't want things to get ugly," he said finally. JD nodded. "Neither do I." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. JD could have left. He could have shaken his head, walked out, and never looked back. He could have made a call, turned this into a headline, Let the internet do what it does best. But instead, he did something no one expected. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "Then let's talk." The room tensed. JD didn't slam the chair down. He didn't puff up his chest or raise his voice. He simply sat, resting his hands on the table like he had all the time in the world. The diner wasn't used to this. Confrontations usually ended quickly, with one side storming out or shutting down. But this wasn't that. Don looked at him for a long moment, then let out a slow exhale. "Talk?" he repeated, like the word itself didn't belong here. JD shrugged. "You don't want me here." "I get that," he said. "What I don't get is why. So let's talk about it." A low chuckle came from the younger guy in the booth. "Man, this guy's got nerve." JD ignored him. Don pulled out the chair across from JD but didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned on it, arms resting against the back. His apron was still dusted with flour, the kind that had probably been there since the morning shift. "I run a business," Don said finally. "I don't pick fights, I don't want headlines, but I got a community to think about." JD nodded. "All right," he said. "So tell me." Don looked over his shoulder, almost like he was waiting for someone else to answer. The waitress by the counter shifted uncomfortably. The man in the work jacket kept his eyes down, but his fork hadn't moved in a while. Then Don turned back. "People here don't like politicians," he said. "Don't trust them. And some of the things you've said, some of the things you've stood for, they don't sit right with folks." JD leaned back slightly. "Fair enough," he said. "But you don't know me, do you?" Don hesitated. "Not personally, no." "Then tell me," JD continued. "If I was just some guy walking in here, not someone you've seen on TV, would we even be having this conversation?" Silence. JD let it stretch, watching Don's expression shift. Just slightly. Not a full change, but something had cracked, even if it was small. Then from the back of the room, the younger guy scoffed. "This isn't about TV, man. It's about people knowing who you really are." JD turned toward him. "And who am I?" The guy grinned like he'd been waiting for this moment. "You're the guy who acts like he understands regular people, but you play politics like everyone else." JD nodded slowly, considering that. "All right," he said. "Then tell me, what do you think I should have done differently?" The guy blinked. That wasn't the response he was expecting. "You want me gone? Fine. But you've got the floor," JD said. "Say what you need to say." The diner was dead silent now. Even the kitchen had gone still. No plates clinking, no orders being called out. Don sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This ain't what I expected tonight." JD cracked a small, tired smile. "Me neither." But, for the first time, the tension wasn't just about division. It was about something else, something closer to understanding. The younger guy still leaned back in his booth, but now there was hesitation on his face. Maybe because he realized JD wasn't arguing, wasn't defending himself, he was just waiting. Don exhaled. "You want to know what people think?" He shook his head. "They think you're full of it." JD didn't react, just tilted his head, slightly, like he was considering the words. "They think you talk about working class folks, but you still play the game. That you make promises like every other guy in a suit. But when it comes down to it, nothing changes." Don exhaled through his nose. "And they don't forget." JD nodded slowly. "I get that." The younger guy scoffed. "That's all you're gonna say?" JD turned toward him. "What else do you want me to say?" The guy straightened in his seat. "I don't know, man. You're supposed to argue, defend yourself. Say something." JD rested his forearms on the table. "You already made up your mind about me before I walked through that door," he said. "You wanted me to get mad, to fight back, so you could feel justified." The guy's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. JD continued, voice steady. "But what if I told you I know exactly what that frustration feels like?" He looked back at Don. "You said nothing changes. I know that feeling. I grew up in it. I watched people around me get left behind. Hell, I felt left behind, and yeah, I went to school. Did things people never expected me to do, but that doesn't mean I forgot. Don's fingers tapped against the chair. His expression was unreadable, but he didn't look dismissive, he looked thoughtful. JD glanced around the diner. You don't have to agree with me. I'm not here to change your minds. But I walked in here as a customer, not a politician, just a guy looking for a meal. Pause. Then from the counter, the old man in the work jacket muttered, Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger. The tension cracked, just slightly. A few people smirked. Even Don let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. JD turned back to him. So what now? Don exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked toward the kitchen, where the cooks were, still watching. Then back at JD. I'll tell you what, Don said finally. You sit here and finish this conversation, and if by the end of it, I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll have my waitress bring you a menu. JD smirked slightly. Sounds like a deal. For the first time that night, the room didn't feel divided. It felt like something else, something closer to a conversation. The air in the diner had changed. The stiffness in Don's shoulders had eased, just a little. The younger guy in the booth had lost his smirk. Now he was sitting up instead of leaning back like this was some kind of show. Even the customers who had stayed quiet, who had just been watching from the sidelines, seemed less certain of their own judgments. JD leaned forward slightly. All right, he said, voice calm. Let's finish this conversation. Don exhaled and dropped into the chair across from him. I'll be honest, Don said, rubbing his hands together. I don't know if you're the guy people think you are. I don't know if you're really looking out for folks like us or if you just know how to talk a good game. JD nodded. Fair enough. Don studied him. What I do know is that around here people got long memories. They remember every promise made to them. Every time someone shook their hand, looked them in the eye, and said they'd do something, only to walk away and never come back. JD tapped a knuckle against the table, thinking. Then he said, I don't blame them for that. Don huffed out a laugh, shaking his head. That's the problem. Nobody ever does. A beat passed. Then from the counter, the old man in the work jacket spoke again. I worked 35 years in a factory. 35 damn years. He set his coffee down with a soft thunk. I watched my neighbors lose their jobs. Watched whole families pack up and leave because there wasn't anything left for them. Watched politicians show up, shake a few hands, tell us they understood, then drive back to wherever the hell they came from. JD met his eyes. And do you think I'm one of those politicians? The old man stared at him for a long time. Then he shrugged. I don't know. But I can tell. You one thing. He pointed a calloused finger toward him. You're the only one who stuck around to listen. That landed. The waitress behind the counter shifted, glancing toward Don. The cooks in the kitchen exchanged looks. Even the younger guy in the booth, who had been the loudest critic, suddenly had nothing to say. JD let the silence settle. Then, he turned back to Don. So what's it gonna be? Don tapped his fingers on the table, looked toward the kitchen, exhaled again. Then he stood. Mary, he called toward the counter. Get him a menu. A ripple of surprise passed through the diner. The younger guy let out a scoff, but he didn't argue. The waitress, Mary, hesitated for only a second before grabbing a laminated menu and walking it over. JD took it with a small nod of thanks. Appreciate it. Don shook his head, half amused, half in disbelief. I still don't know if I like you. JD smiled, flipping open the menu. That's all right. I don't need everyone to like me. Don let out a short chuckle. Then he turned toward the kitchen. All right, boys. Fire up the grill. And just like that, what started as a refusal turned into something no one in that diner would forget. Mary, the waitress, poured JD a cup of coffee without a word. He nodded in thanks. She hesitated for half a second, then muttered, We make it strong here. JD took a sip, raised an eyebrow. I can tell. A few people chuckled. It wasn't much, but it was something. Don was still standing by the kitchen, arms crossed, watching JD like he was trying to figure out what to make of him. Finally, he sighed and walked back over. All right, he said, dropping into the seat across. From him again. Since you're here, tell me something. JD set the menu down. What's that? Don tilted his head slightly. You ever had this happen before? JD thought about that. Not just the rejection. Rejection was part of the job. People loved you one minute, hated you the next. But this? Being told he wasn't welcome, not just as a politician, but as a person. Not like this. Not with this kind of weight behind it. No, JD admitted. Not like this. Don nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he'd been wondering. And you stayed. JD leaned back slightly, took another sip of coffee. Yeah. Don let out a small chuckle. Most guys in your position would have walked out. Maybe made a fuss, called a lawyer. Made sure this place was all over the news by morning. JD smirked. Thought about it. Don laughed at that, shaking his head. Then his expression sobered. You're not going to change everyone's mind. I know. Don exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. And I can't promise I won't regret serving you tomorrow morning. JD grinned. That's fair. From the counter, the old man spoke up again, not looking up from his coffee. Still a damn shame when a man can't get a burger. JD turned toward him. Well, I think that's about to change. A moment later, Mary set a plate down in front of him. A classic diner cheeseburger, hand-cut fries on the side, simple, perfect. JD picked up the burger, took a bite. Silence. Then, with a straight face, he said, little dry. For half a second, the diner was dead still. Then Don barked out a laugh, the first genuine one of the night. A few others chuckled. Mary shook her head. JD set the burger down, wiped his hands on a napkin. Kidding, it's good. Don just shook his head, still smirking. You're a piece of work. JD nodded. I've been told. The younger guy in the booth didn't say anything, but something in his expression had changed. He wasn't sold, not completely. But he wasn't dismissing JD outright anymore either. As JD finished his meal, the diner started feeling like a diner again. Conversations picked up, plates clattered, coffee refills were poured. People still had their opinions, still had their doubts. But for one night, in one small town, a different kind of conversation had happened. And maybe that was enough. Because in a time when everyone's ready to shout, sometimes the real power is in staying, listening, proving, if only for a moment, that not everything has to be a fight. If you made it this far, I've got one question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between walking away and staying to listen? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you found this story worth your time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. There's always another story to tell, and I'll be here to share it with you. Until next time.